A very good morning to all the CA students. I'm sure you must be enjoying your this holiday period during this lockdown period, and you must be taking these adequate studies during this period. It's a golden opportunity for the CA students to cover up their studies without any hassles. To start with, I'm thankful first of all to the Chamber of Tax Consultant for giving me this opportunity on a year-on-year basis to present my topic. I was given to understand that certain lectures were already conducted. However, due to this COVID-19 lockdown, the other sessions were postponed, and I like this idea of the Chamber of Tax Consultant of taking the live webinar when it is quite possible for all the students to undertake or to attend the same from their home. So I'm thankful to the Sachin Bhai, Charmi, Varsha ma'am, Vetang for taking this efforts of coordinating and putting the things in place for this live webinar. I'm sure you must be, all of you must be either the first year articles or the second year articles or the third year articles. So you must be knowing something about the income tax return e-filing and rectification. So the topic that I'm going to cover today is the income tax return e-filing and rectification of the e-filing, rectification of the returns which are already filed. So the subtopics which I'm going to cover up is the overview of the income tax in India, the legal status, how to determine the legal status and the residential status thereupon. What are the heads of income that one need to consider before computing the total income? How to prepare the computation of total income? What are the ITRs that are prescribed by the Income Tax Act and the rules? And the lastly the rectification of the returns of the files which returns which are already filed with the income tax authorities. So to start with, I'm going to cover up the overview of the Income Tax Act in India. As you all of you must be knowing, this Income Tax Act is a 1961 act, so it's almost more than 50 years old act. And law which is given in the Income Tax Act is not the only law, because there are certain other acts or the rules which we need to also consider while reading the Income Tax Act or while applying the interpreting the Income Tax Act provisions of the Income Tax Act. So the relevant things which one should consider or which one should be aware is the Income Tax Act, the Annual Finance Act. What is Annual Finance Act? That I'm going to cover up in my next slide. Income tax rules are also quite important. The circulars and notifications which are issued by the CBDT are also equally important. And last but not the least, the legal decisions of the courts, basically the high courts or the Supreme Courts, are also equally important. So this levy of income tax in India is governed by the Income Tax Act of 1961. We shall briefly refer to this as the Act. This Act has come into effect from 1st of April 1962. So it's basically applicable for AY 62-63, that is financial year 61-62. This Act has 298 sections and the 14 schedules thereto. This Act was pronounced, or it was formed in 1961. It's been amended on year basis by the Finance Act. Now what is Finance Act? Finance Act is nothing but the bill which is approved by both the houses of the parliament, and then the president gives the assent, and then it becomes the Finance Act. Now what is Finance Bill? Finance Bill is the bill which is presented by the finance minister in the parliament. So generally it used to be presented in the February, last days of the February, but since last 4 or 5 years it's been presented on the first day of February every year. So in the finance bill, the finance minister is gives the what are the basically the incomes and expenditures of the country, and first they determine what is the expenditure that they are planning to incur in the subsequent year, and they also give the report card of the expenditure which were incurred in the last year and how that expenditures have been recouped with the income, and for the subsequent year how they are planning to recoup that expenditure with the help of the income. So basically the income for the government is the collection of the direct taxes and the indirect taxes. So every year the finance minister presents the budget in the month of February, and that is presented in the parliament, and thereafter it is placed before the Rajya Sabha also for its comments or for any addition or deletion. And once it is passed by the Rajya Sabha, then it is approved by the it's assented by the President of India. So then it becomes the Finance Act. In the finance bill, the finance minister generally proposes several changes which are applicable either from the first day of April of that year itself, or maybe from the last subsequent year, or it may be a retrospective amendment so that it is applicable even in the past. So we need to be aware as to the amendments which are proposed in the finance bill are applicable from which date, because that date will determine the applicability of that amendment. So that is about the finance bill and the finance act. In pursuance of the power given by the IT Act, rules have been framed to facilitate the proper administration of the Income Tax Act. Every year, the finance minister of the government of India presents this budget to the parliament. Part A of the budget speech contains the proposed policies of the government in this fiscal areas. Part B, which is very important for all of us as a chartered accountant, because it has the proposals basically for the direct tax and the indirect tax. So basically, the Part B cover up the amendment which the finance minister proposes in the Income Tax Act as well as in the indirect tax laws. As I said, in order to implement this above proposal, the finance bill is introduced in the parliament. Then once it is approved by the parliament, it gets assent of the president, and then it becomes the Finance Act. The administration of the direct taxes is looked after by the Central Board of Direct Taxes. Now, the Central Board of Direct Taxes, because as you know, this in India, the government of India has the various ministries. One of the ministries, Ministry of Finance. Under that Ministry of Finance, one of the sub branches, you can say, is the CBDT, and that basically looks after these income tax provisions. And for indirect taxes, we have this CBIC now, Central Board of Indirect Taxes. CBDT is empowered to make the rules for carrying out the purposes of the Act, and for the proper administration of this IT Act and the IT rules which are there. CBDT frames the rules from time to time. These rules are collectively called the IT Rules 1962. It is important to keep in mind that along with the IT Act, these rules should also be studied. Circulars are issued by the CBDT from time to time with certain problems, and which while they want to clarify the certain doubts regarding the scope and meaning of the provision. The circulars are issued for the guidance of the officers or the assessees. The department is bound by the circulars. While the circulars are not binding on the assessee, they can take the advantage of the beneficial circulars. However, for the assessing officer, it is binding on them. What is mentioned in the circular, it has to be followed by the officers, whereas assessee can take the adequate advantage of the circulars which are beneficial to them. So this is about this basic framework of the income tax. Case laws are very important because the study of case laws is an important and unavoidable part of the study of the Income Tax Act. What is case law basically? So case law, to explain it in the simple terms, when an assessee files the return of income within the as per the due dates which are provided in the IT Act, the return which is filed by the assessee may be selected by the assessing officer for the purpose of scrutiny. So assessing officer will see the profit and loss account, balance sheet, and the computation of total income, including the ITR which is filed by the SSE, and will determine whether SSE has declared the correct taxable income or the not. If he feels that certain expenditure was not allowable, then he may disallow it. Or if he feels that certain income is not being taxed, then he may ask the SSE to show cause as to why that income should not be brought to tax. So in that case, assessing officer will determine the what is the assessed income of the assessee for that particular assessment year. If any additions are made in the course of the assessment, assessee has an option to file an appeal before the Commissioner of Appeals, that is the first appellate authority. It's within the Income Tax Act, so it's basically it's an authority within the Income Tax Act only, so it comes under this ability. If the Commissioner of Appeals decides the matter in favor of the department, income tax department or the revenue, assessee still has an option to go before the tribunal, which is the second appellate authority. It's Income Tax Appellate Tribunal. It's a quasi-judicial authority. It is not falling under this framework of this civility. It's a quasi-judicial authority. So it's a alternate to the. So it's not within that limb of that income tax department. It is not falling in the income tax department limb. So after the tribunal, even if the tribunal decides the matter in favor of the revenue, assessee still has an option to be governed by to go for an appeal before the High Court. High courts are basically for one high court for each state they have. If High Court decides the matter against the assessee, assessee has a last option to go before the Supreme Court. So the level of hierarchies which the assessee which is provided in the Income Tax Act is, first we start with the assessing officer, then you go to CIT appeal, that is a first appellate authority, then you go to Income Tax Appellate Tribunal, that is second appellate authority, then you have an option to go to High Court, and then the Supreme Court. Once the Supreme Court decides any matter, be it in favor of the assessee or against the assessee, so that is the final law, basically what we call is the law of the land. So Supreme Court is the final authority on any matter or any issue. Subsequently, if Finance Minister may amend the provisions of the law so as to give effect to that decisions of the Supreme Court, that is quite possible. But the decision given by the Supreme Court is the final law. So whatever these decisions are, the reading of those decisions are quite important, because this decisions helps us in the course of representing our matter before the assessing officer, before the first appellate authority, that is the CIT appeal, Commissioner of Income Tax Appeals, or the Income Tax Appellate Tribunal, or High Court, or the Supreme Court. So whatever these decisions are there already, which are pronounced by the various High Courts, Supreme Courts, Income Tax Appellate Tribunal, study of those decisions is very important, because that helps us in putting our case in a more stronger way. So that was about this decisions or the case laws. Now, as far as binding nature of the various decisions of the courts, Supreme Court decision is binding across the India on all this high courts and all the tribunals. The decisions of high courts are binding with respect to that state itself. So, for example, on a particular issue, if the decision of Bombay High Court is in favor of the assessee, whereas the decision of Gujarat High Court is against the assessee, in that case, if the assessee is situated in India, the jurisdiction officer is Bombay, then the decision of Bombay High Court will prevail over the Gujarat High Court decision. So the district, so the state in which the High Court is situated, it's binding on the decision of that High Court is binding on that state itself in the absence of any contrary decisions. To give you another example, in a particular issue, there is only one decision of the High Court, which is, let's say, the Bombay High Court, and that is in favor of the SSC. So in that case, in the absence of any contrary decisions of any other High Court of any other state, this decision of Bombay High Court will be binding on all the officers of other state as well, because there is no contrary decision of any other High Court. Similarly, the decision of the tribunal is binding in that particular jurisdiction or the district. So that is about the binding nature of the Supreme Court decision, High Court decision, and the tribunal decisions. CIT appeal decisions are binding only on that SSC itself, cannot be applied for other SSC unless it is a group company or you are able to showcase that effects are very similar. So that is what about the case law. So reading of case laws is very important, especially for the students like you all, because these decisions give you an analytical thought as to how you should represent your matter. Because when you read a particular decision, it gives you facts of that decision, what was discussed and what was upheld by the assessing officer at the first appellate authority, what the CIT appeal said for that, whether it is in favor of that or whether it is against that. Thereafter, if the matter is reached up to tribunal, what the tribunal's observation was there. Matter is reached up to High Court also, then you can see that what the High Court has also held, that considering the fact finding of the tribunal, CIT appeal, and the assessing officer. So reading of these decisions will give you different thought processes which are available to represent your matter. So reading of the decision for the students is very important. Once you cultivate that habit of reading, you'll understand the interpretation of the law itself, because there are several issues which you may find in High Court or the Supreme Court decisions, which are wherein they have interpreted the provisions of the law in a very pragmatic manner and a very useful manner as to what was the intention of the law when that section has come into force. As you all know, which I said, assessing officer, CIT appeal, tribunal, High Court, and the Supreme Court. Tribunal is the final fact-finding authority. So if you are to go to High Court, there has to be a question of law. On the question of fact, an appeal cannot be filed before the High Court. Tribunal is the final fact-finding authority. So in the decisions of the High Courts and the Supreme Courts, when you read, you will find that they have interpreted the section, rules, and whatever the circular notification applicable for that. So reading of those decisions is very important. It gives you as to how you can represent your matter in the given facts, and also the interpretation of the section as to what was the intention of the law. So case law reading is very important. Moving further, what is important is the computation of total income and the tax liability. As we all know, income tax is levied on the assessee's total income. The relevant section for that is the charging section, which is section 4. It says the total income of the assessee for the previous year. The term previous year is also defined in section 3 of the Income Tax Act. So basically, the tax is levied on the assessee's total income. That total income needs to be computed as per the provisions which are contained in the IT Act 1961. So we'll go step by step as to what are the procedures that are involved in the computation of total income for the purpose of levy of income tax on that. So first one, which is very important one, is the determination of residential status. We'll see how to determine the residential status. Before that, we need to also decide as to what is the legal status of the assessee. For that, the relevant definition is given in the Income Tax Act. That also we'll see in the subsequent slide. So first you decide what is the residential status. Second is classification of income under the different heads. The third step is exclusion of income which are not chargeable to tax. So basically the incomes which are exempt, which as you all know, which is covered in section 10 of the Income Tax Act. So those incomes will not form part of the total income. Computation of income under the various heads. Thereafter, what is relevant is the clubbing of income of the spouse and the minor child. Then what comes is the step 6, that is set off or the carry forward of and set off of losses. Step 7, you arrive at the gross total income of the assessee. From that gross total income, you're allowed to take benefit of certain deductions which are provided in the Income Tax Act. Once you reduce the eligible deductions, you arrive at the total income. Then step 10, which is the applicability of the relevant rate of tax on that particular total income. Even for levying the tax, you may need to bifurcate the total income into various heads, because it's quite possible that different rates are applicable for the different heads of income. We'll see in the subsequent slide. Then what comes is the levy of surcharge. Earlier there were only very few rates of surcharge, so it was easy to remember. But now we have a lot many rates of surcharge applicable for the different types of SSEs. Also depending on what is the level of total income. So up to particular total income, this will be the rate of surcharge, and thereafter the increased rate of surcharge will be applicable. Then what you have to levy is the health and education cess. It's levied on the tax plus surcharge. Then you arrive at the total tax liability. From that, you have to reduce what are the taxes which are already paid. So one is the advance tax, another is the TDS, and the last one is the self-assessment tax. So with these 13 steps, you arrive at the final figure as to whether any taxes are still payable even after the payment of taxes, self-assessment tax and the TDS and advance tax, or there is a refund, or there are no taxes payable. So with this, we'll first start with the legal status and the residential status. Basically, the term legal status is nothing but the definition of person, which is provided in section 2, subsection 31 of the Income Tax Act. Section 2, subsection 31 covers the 7 different types of assessees within the definition of its term person. First one is the individual. Second is Hindu undivided family, that is HUF. Third one is company. Fourth one is firm, and it also includes the LLP. Fifth one is association of person or the body of individuals. Sixth, local authority. And the 7, artificial juridical person. So first of all, you need to decide as to in which category your assessee falls into. Is it a company? Is it a firm? Is it individual? Is it HUF? Or what? Depending on that, your residential status will needs to be determined, and thereafter the different heads of income will be applicable and the tax rates. Having discussed section 2 subsection 31 dealing with the term definition of person, we shall now proceed with the how to determine residential status. So first we'll take up the residential status of an individual. So for an individual, the relevant section of residential status is section 6, subsection 1, as well as subsection 6. So first of all, you need to decide whether the stay in India of that particular assessee or the individual, was it equal to or more than 182 days in the tax year. If the answer is no, so we move to the right of the flow chart. we have one more condition before we conclude that the assessee is a non-resident. So one more condition which you need to check on the right side of the flow chart. So it says stay equal to or more than 60 days in the previous year and stay more than or equal to 365 days in the preceding 4 tax years. If the answer to that is yes, then you move to the left of the flow chart. If the answer to that is also no, then you directly conclude that the assessee or that individual will be considered as non-resident for the purpose of Income Tax Act. Now we come to the left side of the flow chart. The first one, it says stay equal to or more than 182 days in the tax year. If the answer is yes, you are a resident. You are also treated as a resident if you satisfy the second condition, which is there on the right side of the flow chart, which we just discussed, that is stay more than 360 days, 60 days in the previous year, that is the financial year, and stay more than 365 days in the preceding 4 tax years. Before I just go further, just one thing to note: in the Income Tax Act, there is no concept of financial year. What is relevant is the previous year. Financial year is regarded as the previous year, and the year which is succeeded by the previous year is regarded as the assessment year. In the Income Tax Act, the relevant term is the assessment year, and the year which is preceded by the assessment year is the previous year. So either you say previous year and assessment year, or the assessment year on the previous year. So having said that, the stay in India needs to be determined for the previous year or the financial year. So once you are a resident, you need to again check or the test 2 more conditions before you say whether the assessee is a resident and ordinary resident, or he is a resident but not ordinary resident. So for the resident and ordinary resident, you need to satisfy both the additional conditions, whereas to satisfy one of the 2 additional conditions, then you will be regarded as a resident but not ordinary resident. So what are those 2 conditions? So let us see that. First condition, it says the assessee should be non-resident in 9 out of 10 previous years. In our studies, or even when I was studying, we taught that the condition needs to be read as you should be a resident in 2 out of 10 years, because the law is written in a negative way that assessee should be a non-resident in 9 out of 10 previous years. In other words, or alternatively, we can say that assessee should be resident in at least 2 out of 10 previous years. So if you satisfy this condition, you check one more condition. If you don't satisfy that condition, or if you satisfy that condition, then you are regarded as a yes, and then you directly go to resident but not ordinary resident, because you have satisfied one of the condition, right? The second condition that we need to check is the stay or the presence in India should be less than or equal to 729 days in preceding 7 tax years. If that is yes, then you are resident but not ordinary resident. If that is no, then you are resident and ordinary resident. So basically, law says, to summarize this slide, there are 2 basic conditions and 2 additional conditions. If you satisfy one of the basic condition, then you will be regarded as resident. If you satisfy none of the basic conditions, then you will be straight away regarded as non-resident. So if one of the basic condition is satisfied, you are a resident. If none of the basic condition is satisfied, then you are a non-resident. Further, we need to check both the additional conditions. If both the additional conditions are satisfied, so basically it says resident in 2 out of 10 previous years, and stay should be more than 729 days. So basically 730 days or more than that in preceding 7 tax years. If both the additional conditions satisfied, then you are resident and ordinary resident. If one of the additional conditions are satisfied, then you are a resident but not ordinary resident. Please note that in the law, these conditions are given, additional conditions are given in section 6, subsection 6, and they are worded in a negative way. So if you satisfy one of the condition, or if you satisfy both the condition, then you are regarded as resident but not ordinary resident. Whereas if you do not satisfy both the condition, then you are resident and ordinary resident, that is ROR. And the second term is referred as R but NOR, and the third is NR. So basically what we have to remember, satisfaction of one of the basic condition, you are resident. If not, then you are non-resident. If you satisfy both the additional condition, which is resident in 2 out of 10 years and stay more than 729 days, then you are a resident but resident and ordinary resident. What is the relevance of these three bifurcation? We'll see in the subsequent slide. Before that, there is important thing which is highlighted in the bullets at the end. It says the period of 60 days, which is there on the right side of the flow chart, which is second basic condition, and that stay should be more than 60 days in the previous year. That 60 days will be extended to 180 days in the case of a citizen of India who leaves for the purpose of taking employment outside India, or in the case of citizen of India or the person of Indian origin, PIO, who comes on a visit to India. So in both these cases, the 60-day will be extended to 182 days. So they will not be regarded as a resident unless they stay in India for more than 182 days in that year itself. Indian tax year is from 1st April to 31st March. That is, you must be all you must be knowing that. There are certain changes which were made by the Finance Act 2020, which has amended the several definitions. One of this definition of these residential status. What we just saw, 60 days gets extended to 180 days. The Finance Act says that 180 days will be reduced to 120 days in the case of the individual if their total income other than the income from foreign sources exceeds 15 lakhs, that is 1.5 million during this fiscal year. The term other than the income from foreign sources is defined to mean the income which accrues or arises outside India, except income derived from a business controlled in or a profession set up in India. So basically what you have to remember here is the extension of 60 to 180, which was there earlier, will now be counted from 60 to 120 days. So moment a citizen of India or the person of Indian origin stays in India or visits India for 120 days or more, then he may be regarded as resident provided his income exceeds 15 lakhs, and that income should not include the income from foreign sources. Moving further, there is one more amendment in section 6, which is wherein they have inserted section 6 subsection 1a, which provides that an Indian citizen would be considered as resident in India if such an individual is not liable to tax in any other country or territory by reason of his domicile or residence or any other criteria of similar nature, provided the total income, that is excluding the income from foreign sources, of such Indian citizen exceeds INR 15 lakhs. Basically, this amendment is talking about the Indian citizen will be regarded as resident of India if that individual or that Indian citizen is not liable to tax in any other country in the world. Maybe because by reason of his domicile over there, or because of the residential status in that country, or any other criteria similar to that which are applicable in that country. So basically, if an Indian citizen is not paying tax in any other country across the globe and is earning some income maybe from India or outside India, then he will be regarded as resident of India. You have to check the certain additional condition to say whether it is ROR or R but NOR. But first he will be regarded as R but NOR, provided his income exceeds INR 15 lakhs from India source income, which excludes the foreign source income. So these were the two important amendments which were made by the Finance Act 2020. For the knowledge of students, this finance bill was presented on 1st of February. And it is this finance bill of 2020 is presented on 1st of February and received the assent of President in the last week itself on 27th of March, and it became the law which is applicable from the first day of April. As you all must be knowing that the law to be considered for the purpose of computation of total income is the law which is applicable on the first day of April of the assessment year. If I am talking about assessment year 2021, which has just started yesterday, so the previous year for that will be financial year or the previous year 2019-20. So the law which is applicable on the first day of April 2020 will be relevant for determining the total income and the tax liability of assessment year 2020-21. To move further, the residential status for other category of persons, which are basically the HUF firms, LLP and the AOP, is very simple. These entities are regarded as resident except if their control and management is situated wholly outside India. So they will be regarded as resident unless the control is wholly outside India. Very easy to understand. What is control and management? That is separately been defined. For the company, it is on the basis of its incorporation or the registration. So all the Indian companies which are incorporated in India, they will be by default regarded as resident of India. For the company, there is an additional test or the check which needs to be carried out before you conclude whether the company is a resident or a non-resident. That is its place of effective management. If that place of effective management is situated in India, then that company, although it may be a foreign company or it is not incorporated in India, a company will be regarded as a resident of India. So basically, the second condition is applicable or to be checked in the case of a foreign company, because all the Indian companies will be by default be regarded as resident of India. So that was about the residential status. Scope of total income. Having you determine residential status, it is important to understand what all incomes will be considered in the hands of the different types of assessees. Assessees are basically the person, which we already seen, section 2, subsection 31. Definition of person includes 7 categories of person. So if the residential status of an individual is R and OR, then the global income will be taxable. So if an individual who satisfies one of the basic conditions and both the additional condition, he will be regarded as R and OR. And in that case, whether he is based in India or he earns income in India or outside India, wherever the income is earned, that income will be taxable in India. So the global income is taxable for R and OR. For R but NOR and NR, what is taxable is the income received or deemed to be received in India, and income which accrues or arises or is deemed to accrue or arise in India. Income received, very easy to understand. Once it is received in India or the territory of India or an Indian bank account, so it is taxable in India. What is deemed to be received? That is given in section 8. That is given in section 7. So some of this PF contributions and this superannuation contribution, they are income which are deemed to be received in the hands of the employee. A very small category of taxpayers which are attracted or which are affected by this deemed to be received in India. Second limb is very important. Income which accrues or arises. Accrues or arises meaning the income which is accruing in India. Now, how the income will accrue in India? For the salaried class, the income will accrue if their employment is undertaken in India. Then you say income is accruing in India. For the business class or the professionals, the income will accrue in India provided the relevant activities which are generating the business or which are generating the income are undertaken in India. So once any activities which are generating the income are undertaken in India, we say that income is accruing or arising in India. The second limb, that is the sublimb of this second limb, that is deemed to accrue or arise in India, is very important. That is given in section 9, and that is very exhaustive, very elaborative. It covers various things. For example, if a non-resident has a flat in India, from that he is earning the rental income, whether that income will be taxable in India, assuming that individual is a non-resident for the purpose of Income Tax Act. So the section 9(1)(1), it says if any income which is accruing from a capital asset situated in India, then that income is said to be deemed to accrue or arise in India. So any rental income, any capital gain income from the sale of that flat or the sale of any land, building, or the premises will be considered as deemed to accrue or arise in India in the hands of the non-resident. The second one is which is very important, is the salary income, which is also covered in deeming fiction of section 9, which says that salary is as such is accruing in India. However, if an employee is outside India and his leave period is preceded and succeeded by the work in India, then even that income pertaining to that leave period will be taxable in India. So basically, it's a deeming fiction. Generally, it doesn't accrue in India. The income which is payable for that period doesn't accrue in India. However, if that leave period is preceded and succeeded by the work in India, then that income will also be taxable in India. Secondly, it also covers the interest payments, certain specified interest payments, royalty payments by resident to non-resident, royalty payment by even by non-resident to non-resident, provided the income generating activity or the source of income is in India. So basically, this deeming fiction, it revolves around the fact that source of income is situated in India or is undertaken in India, or that source leading activities are undertaken in India. If that is the case, then that income is said to be deemed to accrue or arise in India, and that income will be taxable for two category of the taxpayers, RBUT, NOR and NR. Whereas for the other categories of person, if they are resident, then global income is taxable. If they are non-resident, then the income which is accruing, arising, or deemed to accrue arising in India, that is taxable. Having determined the legal status and the residential status, it is important to understand where these tax rates are given generally. As I earlier said, that the finance minister presents the finance bill. It has part A, part B, and then the first schedule of those part A, part B. So the first schedule, there is a part A, part B, and part C. Part A covers the tax rates which are applicable for the immediately upcoming assessment year. So for example, if I talk about the Finance Bill 2020, Part A of first schedule to the Finance Act 2020 contains the tax rates which are applicable for the assessment year 2021. Part 2 and Part 3 are basically the tax rates given for the purpose of TDS and advance tax. What is TDS and advance tax? That we'll see in the subsequent slide. So the Part B is basically the TDS rates which are applicable for the upcoming financial year or the previous year. So if I talk about Finance Act 2020, the Part 2 and Part 3 contains the rates which are applicable for the previous year 2020-21, that is assessment year 21-22, right? So okay, there is one more thing. The part 3 of the Finance Act 2020 will become the part A of the part 1 of the Finance Bill 2020-21. So in the next year, part 3 of the last year becomes part A of the first year of the subsequent year. Moving further, what are the heads of income which one should consider? As we all know, there are basically the 5 heads of income. First one is the income from salary. The second is income from house property. The third one is income from business or the profession. Fourth is capital gain. And the fifth is income from other sources. So these are the 5 heads of income which are given in the Income Tax Act. Very easy to understand. All of you know about these heads of income. So my role here today will be to enlighten you with what are the things which you should consider while determining the income under the various heads of income. So what are the things which you should consider? To start with, the first one is the salary income. Salary income, very easy to understand and very easy to calculate the income also. So generally, in the context of salary income, the TDS is deducted by the employer, and employer issues a certificate called Form 16 along with Form 12A if it is applicable. What is Form 16? What is Form 12A? I'm sure you must have been understood in the previous lectures of TDS in last month. We'll repeat in very short time. So what is Form 16? Form 16 is basically the salary certificate, you can say, or the TDS certificate, which certifies the salary which is paid by the employer along with the TDS deducted by the employer. Form 16 is generated from the various TDS returns which are filed by the employer. We all know that TDS is required to be deducted on a monthly basis and needs to be deposited by 7th of next month, except for the month of March, wherein the date is given up to 30th of April. So if an employer is deducting the TDS on a monthly basis and depositing by 7th of every month, is also required to file quarterly TDS returns. So the applicable form for the TDS on salary is Form 24Q, which is required to be filed on a quarterly basis within 1 month from the end of the quarter. And for the last quarter, Jan to March, the due date is 31st of May. So the employer files this quarterly TDS returns, wherein he has to declare what are the salary paid to all the employees and the TDS which is deducted in all the 4 quarters. In 4th TDS return, that is Jan to March quarter, along with the salary paid during that quarter, employer is also required to provide part 2 of that Form 24Q, which has various columns starting from name of the employee, period during which that employee was employed in the company or the firm, what is the taxable salary which is paid by the employer in the entire year. These all numbers are given for the whole year. Employer also has an option to consider the income from other sources, income under other heads of income other than the salary income. If an employee declares the house rental income or the house rental loss interest, an employer is bound to consider that If an employee declares income from other sources, that is basically the interest or any other income, then employer is also required to consider that interest income while determining the taxable income of that employee. So in that part 2, he has to give all those details, other income details. Further, employer is also required to give the details of deductions which are considered by the employer while arriving at the total income. So those deduction details will be provided by the respective employees. What are those deductions could be? ATC deduction, which are generally the LIC, PPF, school fees, or the principal repayment of the housing loan. So these are some of the deductions which are eligible under section 80C, 80D for the mediclaim and other things. So employer is also required to provide the details of those deductions, ATC, ATD in that part 2 of form 24Q of last quarter. Then total income will be computed for each and every employee. Applicable tax rates will be applied on those income. And the tax liability will be computed including surcharge and the education cess. Having determined the tax liability, employer is also required to give the what is the TDS which is deducted by the employer in that respective previous year. And then the last column will be whether any amounts or additional amount is payable or it is refundable. From that part 2 of form 24Q of that last quarter, employer can generate form 16 part A. It's very, please understand this. What is generated from this part 2 of form 24Q of last quarter is part A of form 16. And this is generated from TRIS's website, which you all must be aware. While filing, after filing TDS return, you can check the status of your TDS return, whether it is processed with default or without default. And if once it is processed without default, you can place the request for form 16 part A. Once you have the part A, employer is also required to give the details of part B. Part A generally consists of the TDS details, purely TDS. It will have a quarter-wise breakup. Quarter 1, what was the income paid and what was the TDS, and also gives the details of the TDS monthly paid. Employer is also required, as I said, is also required to provide part B of form 16, which is either manually generated or with the help of the software. Part B provides the details of salary paid component wise, breakup wise. What are the deductions with the employer is considered? What is the total income? What was the tax payable? And what is the TDS which is deducted by the employer? So that is basically a form 16. What is form 12BA? It's basically the certificate for the perquisites which are taxable in the hands of the employee. As we all know, the rent accommodation perquisite is one of the perquisite. Car perquisite could be one of the things. So what are the perquisites which are taxable in the hands of the employee needs to be provided by the employer in form 12BA. So that one has to consider while determining the salary income. Or what is relevant could be the pension certificate, details of salary arrears. If there is a job change of the SSC in the middle of the year, then full and final settlement from the previous employer is also needs to be seen. If an SSC is having the foreign source income, or he is employed at 2 places, that is also quite possible. An employee may be employed with the Indian company as well as with the foreign company, which is a group company of that Indian company or the subsidiary of the Indian company. Or maybe the foreign company may be the parent company, Indian company may be the subsidiary company. So if that is the case, then he has to one has to also consider the foreign salary slips, foreign tax returns filed, because that will give what was taxable in that foreign country, what was the income which was taxable, and what are the taxes paid in that country, what was the refund claim. So all those one has to consider while determining the salary income in case of there is dual employment with the and one being a foreign employer. It also consider the rent agreement and the rent receipts if it is not considered by the employer. As I said, employer while determining the total income, he has an option to consider the HRA benefit or any allowances benefit, provided it is declared by the employee. If employee does not declare, then employer is not duty bound to consider the same. So for example, if employee has forgotten to provide the details of his rent paid or the HRA benefits, we all know what is HRA, right? It's covered in section 10, subsection 13A. Basically, that's whatever these HRA allowance, house rent allowance is received from the employer, you can claim the exemption subject to this three conditions. The first one being rent paid minus 10% of the salary. The second one is the 50% or the 40% of this basic salary. And the third condition is actual HRA received. So lower of these three is eligible to be claimed as deduction under section 10 subsection 13A. So if employer is not considered, we as a consultant can consider while filing the return of income. So for that purpose, we have to also see the rent agreement and the rent receipts, which is paid by the employee to the landlord. You can also consider the travel bills for claiming the LTA benefits, details of any PF withdrawn during the year. If there is a change of job in the middle of the year, then one has to also consider the gratuity or the leave encashment which are received or receivable from the previous employer. Details of notice pay or the joining bonus also needs to be considered while determining the income under the salary. House property income. Basically, the charging section here is section 22. In the context of salary, it was section 16 was the charging section. Section 15, sorry. In the context of house property, section 22 is the charging section. Under the house property, you need to first decide whether the house property is a self-occupied property, or it's a let-out property, or it's a deemed to be let-out property. Self-occupied, very easy to understand. If it is used for the purpose of own residence, then self-occupied property. If it is an extra flat or it is actually let out and rental income is earned, then it's a let out property. If it is more than one property which is being let out, or if a property is not let out for certain purpose, for example, if an associate has two houses, one is being used for the purpose of its own residence and the other one is not let out, the first one, which is in which he is living, will be considered self-occupied property for the purpose of own residence, and the second one, which is although not let out, will be regarded as deemed to be let out. So basically, we have three types of classification in the under the house property: SOPR, LOP, and DLOP. SOP, the rules are very simple. You have to consider the gross annual value at nil, and you have to reduce the interest which is paid for on the interest which is paid on the loan, which is taken for several purposes. The purposes are given in section 24 for the acquisition, for the reconstruction or repairing or renovation. So generally in SOP, you'll have the negative amount, that is a loss from house property. Whereas in LOP and DLOP, it could be a positive income or it could be a negative loss. Loss can also be possible if the interest paid is higher. In the LOP and DLOP, the rules are, we all know what is how to determine the GAV based on the municipal valuation, fair rent and the standard rent. And from that GAV can reduce municipal taxes which are actually paid or payable. And you can also reduce 30% of this NAV. Whereas in the case of SOPR, you are not allowed to take the municipal taxes benefit, because what you have to consider directly the NAV at nil. Net annual value is the nil. You can only reduce the interest on house property, not even reduce 30%. Whereas in the case of LOP and DLOP, you can reduce the municipal taxes, you can reduce the 30% of NAV and the interest on loan which is paid. So what is required to be seen is, in the case of house property income, and to undertake these details of the agreement, or if it is a let out, then rent agreement, address of the property, co-owner details, what are the respective shares of the co-owners, so that is important. Interest certificate which is issued by a bank for the purpose of housing loan, possession letter, municipal taxes payment, receipts, if any TDS is deducted on the rental income, then that also needs to be considered. Details of pre-construction interest, as we all know, the interest is available once the property is in existence. So the whatever the interest which are paid in the during the period of construction, that is regarded as the pre-construction interest, and it is available in 5 equal installments starting from the year in which the property is in existence, or the property is constructed. Ownership details. So these are several details which one should keep in mind while computing the house property income. Moving further, the third head of income is the business income. Very easy to understand, and we have been undertaking this exercise of profit and loss account starting from standard 11. What one is to consider while computing business income is the trading and profit and loss account, if it is a manufacturing concern. Otherwise, it's a profit and loss, or the income and expenditure account, and balance sheet. If it is needs to be audited, then you also look into the books of accounts and the relevant things of tax audits. Bank statement one has to go through. Sales register, or the details of sales which are made during the year. Purchase register. TDS certificates, again it will be applicable for all the heads of income. GST returns, or these VAT return if it is applicable, to determine whether the income, to determine whether turnover what is declared in the respective VAT or the GST return tallies with your profit and loss account or not. You will also see various ration certificates, or the details of all the expenses relating to businesses. Other than business, also you have to also consider whether it's there is in capital gain, salary, and blah blah blah. So these are the very easy business income. Very easy. Once you have the profit and loss account and the balance sheet and some of the other details, you can compute this income taxable under the head business income. How do we compute business income? We start with net profit before tax or after tax, as the case may be. You add back the first of all the depreciation or the expenses which are not allowable, or they are allowed under separately under the different heads of income, and you reduce the income which is not taxable, or they are taxable under the different heads of income. Then you arrive at the income from business or the profession. The next head of income is the capital gain income. Capital gain, again divided into two parts: short-term capital gain and long-term capital gain. A gain which is arising from the transfer of short-term capital asset is regarded as short-term capital gain, and the gain which is arising from long-term capital asset is regarded as a long-term capital gain. Now, what is short-term and what is long-term? For that, we need to undertake what is the period of holding. The definition of the short-term capital asset is given in section 2, subsection 42A, and the definition of long-term is given. Long-term capital asset is given in section 2, subsection 29A. Depending on the period of holding of the respective asset, if it is for the shares, then it's a 12 months. If it is for property, then it's 24 months. Depending on the period of holding, you need to decide whether the asset is the short-term capital asset or the long-term capital asset. And then we compute the gain or the loss, and then it will be regarded as short-term capital gain or the long-term capital gain, as the case may be. So in the context of property, you need to have the sale and purchase date of the property, including the stamp valuation of the property, documents for the cost of improvement if there is anything. If there are shares which are held as a stock in trade, then you need to also have a stock statement in the case of trading in shares, specifying the sale value and the purchase value. In the case of other capital assets, the cost of purchase, any other capital asset, the cost of purchase, sale value, and the cost of improvement, if any. Details of expenses incurred on transfer, if there is anything like brokerage or anything. We all know that after once we determine the capital gain, there are sections which gives the benefit of the amount, sale consideration amount, which is reinvested. Basically section 54, 54B, 54EC, 54F. So if assessee has reinvested the sale consideration or the capital gain, as the case may be, then one has to also consider the benefit which is available under section, or deduction which are available under section 54, which is the sale of you sell a house and purchase another house. 54B for sale of agricultural land and investment in agricultural land. So 54EC for investment in bonds, specified bonds. 54F for sale of any other asset other than the house property and purchasing another house property. So depending on the section which is applicable, one has to also consider the deduction which are available under the respective sections. Details of investment, anything in capital gain account scheme. And the last but not very important, reversal of deduction claimed earlier if the amount of capital gain is not utilized for specified purposes. How one will come to know? For example, in one of your assessee's case, assessee has claimed a deduction of section 54 in assessment year 17-18 or assessment is 16-17 as the case may be. While claiming the deduction, as you all know, section 54 says you have to invest the capital gain proceeds for purchase of new house. However, within that prescribed time limit of section 54, assessee could not purchase the new house. So section 54 gives an option to the assessee that he can invest the capital gain amount in the capital gain account scheme. It's an account basically opened with the nationalized banks. So if, for example, if an assessee has invested those proceeds in capital gain account scheme or is deposited in that CGA's account, section 54 says if you are deposited in CGA's account, then you have to utilize within the prescribed time limit of 3 years of section 54. If it is not, then that deduction which was claimed in that earlier year will now be taxable in the future years. So one has to also look into the deductions which were claimed in the past under this section of section 54, 54EC or 54F, and has to see whether the conditions were fulfilled subsequently or not. If they are not, then that gain will be taxable in the respective year. So for example, if CGA's account proceed or CGA's amount, the amount which is deposited in CGA's account could not be utilized for purchase of new house, and that CGA's accounts has matured after 3 years, then that proceeds which are received in the bank account statements will now be taxable in the year in which these proceeds are received. So deduction which was claimed earlier will no more be available now. So this is very important capital gain head. The last head of income, which is income from other sources. Anything which doesn't fall in any of the 4 heads of income, but if it is an income, then this will be classified in income from other sources. So for example, income from saving bank interest account or the FD interest account or dividend as the case may be. Winning from lottery, horse races will all come under the income from other sources. Charging section for this is section 56. Having discussed 5 heads of income, now we shall turn to clubbing of income of the spouse and the minor child. For clubbing, the section will apply only if there is an income which is generated in the hands of the spouse or the minor child on account of certain diversion of certain amounts or the income in their name. So for example, if a husband or the husband invests certain amounts in the name of the wife and any income is generated from that investment will be taxable in the hands of the donor or the husband. because clubbing sections are applicable. Similarly, for the minor child also. So once the income is clubbed, then we shall turn to set off and carry forward of losses. For set off and carry forward, one has to only remember the how the set off mechanism operates and the number of years to which you can carry forward the losses. So for the house property losses, it's allowed to be carried forward for 8 years. For non-speculative business losses, again 8 years. For speculative, it's 4 years. Long-term and short-term capital losses, again 8 years. Loss from owning and maintaining horse races, 4 years. And unabsorbed depreciation is allowed for any number of years. Now, what are the set of rules? Set of rules, easy to remember. What one has to remember here is, in salary, there cannot be loss. So loss can only arise in the under the head house property, business income, or capital gain losses, or the fourth could be other sources. Other sources, again, it's very rare, but it may be possible. If the expenses incurred for earning that income are more under section 57, then there could be losses. So again, salary, you can set off all types of losses except business loss cannot be set off against the salary. For capital gain, it has a very specific rules for set off. So again, the capital gain losses cannot be set off against the salary income. So house property and other sources can be set off. Against business income, anything can be set off. For capital gain, we have a restriction. Short-term capital loss can be set off against short-term capital gain and the long-term capital gain, whereas long-term capital loss can be set off against the long-term capital gain. What one has to remember, because I heard in many from the many students also from the seniors also, what needs to be adjusted is the loss. So people sometimes say that income adjust कर दिया loss में. What needs to be adjusted is the loss. Income adjust नहीं होता है. Adjust होता है loss against the income. So for capital gain, we have a restriction that one has to remember, and for salary and business, there is a restriction that business loss cannot be adjusted against the salary income. All other losses can be adjusted against each heads of income. Moving further, after the set off of losses of section up to section 74, what we arrive at is the gross total income. From this gross total income, we can claim certain deductions. What are those deductions? There are three types of deduction. Basically, are divided in three buckets. One, deduction which are in respect of certain payments like life insurance payments, contribution to provident fund, medical insurance, payment of interest on loan taken for education, rent paid, which is other than 1013A, 80 GGA, certain donations 80G, and contribution to political parties. Second bucket, deductions. It has deduction in respect of certain income. For example, infrastructure developers, they can claim certain deduction. SEZ developers, cooperative societies. Fifth one is important, deduction in respect of employment of new employees, 80JJAA. Interest on saving bank account, 80 TTA. And there are other deductions. For the third bucket is for the other deduction for certain persons with disabilities. So these are basically deductions which are available. Once you reduce the deductions, what you arrive is the total income. Once you are at total income, for individual HUF, AOP, BOI, and artificial juridical person, it is taxable at the slab rates. What are the slab rates? We'll see in the subsequent slide. Plus surcharge and education cess. Surcharge may vary from 10% to 37%. For firms, LLP and local authorities, 30% plus surcharge of 12% above 1 CR, and health and education cess of 4%. For domestic companies, various rates are there. Earlier it was only one rate of 30%. But now it says if the turnover of domestic companies less than or up to 400 crores, that is 4,000 million during FY 18-19, then the tax rate could be 25%. Otherwise, it will be 30%. Also, the domestic companies have an option of two sections to be. They can choose to be governed by the two section. One is the 115BAA, which has the rate of 22%. plus flat rate of surcharge of 10% and education cess of 4%. Whereas once you opt for this 115BAA, then no other deductions and incentives are allowed to be claimed. There is one more section which provides a rate of 15%, that is for certain domestic companies who are into manufacturing business, provided they are incorporated after a specified date. Again, 15% rate is given, but there are no deductions and incentives are available to that company. For foreign company, the rate is 40% plus surcharge and education cess. There are special rates are given for long-term capital gain. Section 112 earlier was there. Now it is 112A. Long-term capital rate, tax rate is 20%. For shares, it is now 112A, so 10%. For short-term, the rate is 15% under section 111A. Rebate under 87 is also available for the individual residents. 100% of the tax rebate is available for the total income up to rupees 5 lakhs. Tax rates for an individual for the assessment year 2021 is up to rupees 2,50,000. There is no tax. 2,50,000 to 3 lakh, 5%. From 3 lakh to 5 lakhs, again 5%. 5 lakhs to 10 lakhs, 20%. And above 10 lakhs, it is 30%. For senior citizens up to 3 lakhs, there is no tax. And for super senior citizens above the age of 80 years, there is no tax up to 5 lakhs. Rest of the rates remains the same. These rates are exclusive of surcharge and education cess. This one table is very important. New tax rates for an individual for the these rates were there earlier for the FY 1920, but in the recent Finance Act 2020, they deferred these rates to the financial year 2021. These rates are an option given to the individuals, wherein the rates are like up to 2,50,000 no tax, from 2,50,000 to 5 lakh 5%, from 5 lakh to 7.5 10%, and so on. The highest rate 30% is attracted only if the income is above 15 lakhs. This is an option given to the individual. Either they can be governed by the old rates and claim certain deductions and allowances like HRA deduction, allowances deduction. Whereas if an individual opts for the new tax rate, then those allowances of HRA, conveyance allowance are not available, and there are certain other allowances which are not available. And the flat rate of this is applicable. Tax rates for the corporate assessees, 30%. Domestic we already seen, foreign company we already seen. Cooperative societies up to 10,000, 10%, 10 to 20,000, 20%, about 27, 30%. Rate of surcharge is important. For individual HUF, up to 50 lakhs, no surcharge. 50 lakhs to 1 crore, 10%. 1 crore to 2 crore, 15%. 2 crore to 5 crore, 25%. 5 crore to 10 crore, 37%. And thereafter, it is 37%. For firms and local authorities, 12%. Domestic companies, 7%. No surcharge up to 1 CR. 1 CR to 10 CR, 7%. Above 10 CR, 12%. For foreign company, up to 1 CR, no surcharge. 1 CR to 10 CR, 2%. Above 1 CR, above 10 CR, 5%. And 12% for the cooperative societies. On all these rates, tax rates and surcharge, we have a health and education cess at the rate of 4%. Having determined the tax liability, we have to reduce what is TDS and advance tax, which is appearing in the form 26 AS. TDS, there was a separate session, I understand, in the last month. So you all must be aware about the TDS. Basically, in general, what we have the TDS is 194 CHIJ and also 195 for the non-residents. So any TDS which is deducted on the income of the assessee can be claimed while filing, can be claimed as a credit while filing the income tax return of that assessee. Further, if there is any advance tax paid during the due dates of advance tax, 15 June, September, December, and 15th of March, that can also be claimed as a deduction. What you arrive at thereafter is the whether there is any tax payable. So if you pay that tax, that is self-assessment tax, and you reduce that self-assessment tax, you arrive at a nil amount. Or if there is no self-assessment tax payable, there could be either nil position or the refund that can be claimed as a refund in the ITR. It's better while filing the ITR, while filling the ITR, it's better that you use the pre-filled XML for this TDS and advanced tax. This pre-filled XML option is available in the e-filing option once you log in. So it will, all those details of the TDS and advanced tax will be automatically picked up in the ITR. Refund we already seen. What are types of ITR? Basically ITR 1 to 7. ITR 1 is applicable for the individual who is a resident other than not ordinary resident having income from salary and one house property up to and having total income up to rupees 50 lakhs. ITR 2 is applicable for individual and HUF not having income from profits and gains from business or profession. ITR 3 is for the individual HUF who are having the income from profits and gains. And ITR 4 is for the basically for the presumptive taxation. So ITR 1 to 4 is applicable for individual HUF and firms, basically individual HUF. How to remember this? ITR 4 for the presumptive taxation, ITR 3 if you are having the business income, ITR 1 and 2 you decide whether income is up to 50 lakhs or it is above 50 lakhs, and whether there is one house property or there is whether that assessee is a director in a company or not. So depending on that you choose the relevant ITR for the individual HUF. ITR 5 is for the persons other than individual HUF. That is basically for the AOPs and BOIs. ITR 6 is for the company, and ITR 7 is for the certain specified persons. How to file ITR? You log in, you go to e-file option, you go to select income tax return, and the next screen will be displayed. So you select the assessment year, you select the ITR form number, filing type, whether it is original, revised, whether you are liable for 44AB, that is tax audit, and then you upload the XML file. If it is return needs to be signed digitally, then you have to also generate the signature file, attach that signature file, and your return will be uploaded. So this was basically the filing process of filing return. What one should remember is, because in the today's scenario, we all are very equipped to the filing of return through software. So in software, when we are filing the return, please understand the process which is used by the software. Have your return of income first prepared in the Excel file or in the manual handwritten, and then you punch the data, because when you are directly using the software will calculate the result automatically, and you will not come to know how the output or the total income is arrived at. So it's better that you first compute in the mode other than the software, and then you put the data in software for easy filling of ITR. Moving to the next topic, that is preparation of computation, which is very simple, and it's available in the slides also, which one can go through. Due to paucity of time, I will not be able to run through. Basically, I have given some of the formats in which one can prepare the computation in the Excel as to what all detail one has to capture, and how detailed the computation should look like. So I've given some of the examples of computation of total income. I've also given the examples of trading and profit and loss account, personal capital account, personal balance sheet, how one should look like. Because these all are very important. Because tomorrow one should be aware as to what was your position on the last preceding 31st March. What are the assets and liabilities of the SSE? What is the capital account? One should know that balance of capital account. So it's important that you prepare in detail the balance sheet, capital account, and the computation of income. So these all formats are given. One can go through it easily subsequently. I'll move to the next part, which will not take more than 5 minutes. Rectification of mistakes. Mistake is quite possible when you file the return. It's possible that there is some mistake in the while filing the return. Or it is quite possible that once the return is processed by the income tax authority, there is a mistake, which there is a mistake, or there is a particular detail which the officer is not considered, or the CPC Bangalore is not considered. For that also rectification application can be filed. For filing the rectification application, you have to go to the income tax portal, login. To select in the e-file menu, there is an option called rectification. Once you select rectification, the screen will look like this. You have 4 options to consider. You have 4 options in which you can file the rectification. The first one is tax credit mismatch correction. wherein if there is any mismatch in TDS or the TCS or the advanced tax or the self-assessment tax, that can be, for that rectification application can be filed. Return data correction, there are various options are given, we'll see in the subsequent slide. If you want to only reprocess the return, for example, for if there is any TDA, for if there is any interest or the liability which is not payable, however the officer has made it payable, then you can just ask the officer to reprocess the return considering the interest things. So that option is also available. Additional information for 234C only for very limited purpose. First one, tax credit mismatch correction. Once you select that, you have another three options: TDS on other than salary details, TCS details, and IT details. You can select the relevant tab, you can select the relevant item in that, and file the rectification application. When you select the second option, which was return data correction XML, here there are various rectification reasons are given. So for example, tax payment is not made as per CPC order, income chargeable under the head business and profession has been wrongly considered under some other heads. You are requesting for cancellation of the earlier year's demand, details of deduction which were wrongly considered in the while filing the return or by the officer, or income chargeable under capital gain has been wrongly considered, and so on and so forth. Or the MAT credit has not been allowed by the officer or it has been partially allowed by the officer, then also the second option is available. If you are asking for reduction in tax rate because of the domestic company and non-domestic company, that option is also available. Request for change of residential status is also available. So there are various rectification reasons are given. For one of those reasons, you can file the rectification. Once you select the option, the screen will ask you to select the relevant schedules of the ITR. In this option, you have to also generate the new XML file and upload it on the portal. The third option which was there is only reprocess the return. So here your only 26 years details will be matched with the ITR details and it will be reprocessed. The fourth option is for the addition information for 234C. Here if there is any 234C interest, as we know, it's basically for the deferment of the advance tax. So if advance tax, if there is any advance tax are not paid, but if there is any capital gain income during that quarter, then advance tax may not, then 234C interest may not be payable on that particular installment. Then you can provide those details of this 234C details for in this schedule and ask the CPC to reprocess the return. So once you upload this XML, it will be reprocessed. If you click on submit, it will be application will be filed. You can check the status of the rectification request by going to my account, view filed return of form, and check the rectification status as to whether it is processed or not processed. You can also withdraw this rectification request if you feel that it was not required to be filed. Rectification can be filed only for return which are already processed by CPC. So if officer processes a return, or if he issues 143(1) intimation, and rectification, online rectification option is not available. It is available only if that return is processed by the CPC Bangalore. So with this, I will end my presentation. I'll be happy to take any questions if students has anything to ask for. Thank you for your patient listening, and thank you for the chamber for once again for giving me this opportunity. One humble request to all the students: make best use of this time which is available in this lockdown period for upgrading the knowledge, for learning, unlearning and relearning something new. Don't waste time. This is a golden opportunity which is available to you all as an article students, which may not be available to all the students. So I request, please take this opportunity in the best possible manner and the best positive way by going back to your studies, relearning something and updating your knowledge. Thank you once again. Thank you Chamber of Tax Consultants and the Students Committee for giving me this opportunity.